Thank you very much. And I'll say that last thing again very quickly. In the colonies in North America, the rigid old country attitude of deferring to those that are above you socially began to erode as more people were able to vote, more people owned property in the North American colonies, and those that were leaders, they were held more accountable because they were so far away from the mother country, from Parliament, and from the king. So let's jump in now to the next colony that we want to talk about. And that is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We've got Jamestown, Virginia, about 500 miles south in the Chesapeake Bay area. And they set up the first representative government in America in 1619, the Virginia House of Burgesses. And then in 1624, they became a royal colony. Then the Pilgrims founded Plymouth in 1620. Let me get my visual for you. All righty, let me find it here. Not the one I wanted. Sorry, let me get the next one up. So this here says colony number 2, Massachusetts, and this slide presentation is set up in the order of the 13 colonies. So Plymouth was founded in 1620. And then Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. But they eventually merged into just one colony, Massachusetts, in 1691. So I don't want you to be confused, but in this presentation, Massachusetts is considered second after Virginia because of the Pilgrims part of their founding. So here were the Pilgrims down here already. I'll make this a little bigger for you. So remember, the Pilgrims hit here first in 1620, did the Mayflower Compact, then came over here and founded the settlement of Plymouth, and their territory was what I call the flexed muscle arm of Massachusetts. This here is Cape Cod Bay. So remember, these were separatists. They completely wanted to break away from the Church of England, to separate. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in 1630, and it was also founded as a religious haven, and the group that founded them were the Puritans. The Puritans were those who didn't want to break away from the Church of England. They wanted to purify it from within. And they did not have the freedom that they wanted in England, so they sailed to the new land, and their thinking was that they're going to come to North America. They're going to set up this religious utopia, and they are going to be an example for England to look upon. And the first governor was John Winthrop, who, before they came onto the land, preached a sermon while they were still on their ships, in which he mentioned this new venture being a city upon a hill that would shine back to England and show the church officials what a true Christian commonwealth looks like. Now, can anybody give a just your best guess, or maybe you know this, when John Winthrop uses that phrase from the Bible, a city upon a hill, comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. When he uses that phrase, anybody want to guess what that is kind of the seed of that affects American history and still affects us today? Well, there is, did I see a hand or? Okay, there is a political idea that you still hear today. It really has come under attack, though, that America is an exceptional country. And so the philosophy is called exceptionalism, that the United States of America, in its being founded, was founded as an exceptional land, the new world, that would be a bright, shining example to the old world. And so we can see that, we can see it in a seed form in Winthrop's sermon, where he mentions that the new Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to be a city on a hill. We're going to come over here. We're going to establish our settlements. We're going to set up a congregational church. And this is very important. Church and state were not separated with the Puritans. Matter of fact, the leaders of the Boston settlement, the political leaders, had to be church leaders. And so there was no separation of church and state. They were planning on being a utopia of church and state that would be an example to England. And we can see why, right? Because in England, you would have one king who was Catholic and would persecute the Protestants. And then one king, the next king might be Protestant and persecuted the Catholics. And then finally, one of the kings decided, you know, we're going to break away from the Roman Church and we're going to form the Church of England. And it was a mixture of Catholicism and Protestantism. And then whatever kind of, you know, whatever way the king or queen leaned after that, if they leaned towards Catholicism, they would persecute the Protestants. So that's why the Puritans came over, to get away from that persecution and to set up the perfect government. So any questions on that? You need to know about the concept of exceptionalism for the test. And you need to know that part of the seed for that was John Winthrop's City on a Hill sermon. So now we have Jamestown, founded primarily for economic reasons. There was, religious people there, but the main reason was to, find gold, get land, and then by this time, tobacco is a very good cash crop. Plymouth was founded as a religious haven. But Plymouth looked more towards economic fortune more than the Puritans. The Puritans were even more to the extreme in founding a religious society than the Pilgrims. And the Pilgrims never really grow above 7,000. So the Plymouth colony kind of levels out. The Puritan, the Massachusetts colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Boston, Salem area, within 10 years, by 1640, had grown to around 10,000 people. So they were growing. Plymouth had kind of stagnated, and eventually they merge and become one. And the Puritans are the dominant religious leaders. So, any questions on that before we move on to the founding of Rhode Island? Are we having a good time?
Yeah. Yes.
Awesome. So, you have all these Puritans coming over from England, and it's called the Great Migration. They're leaving England to escape from persecution and come to this new haven in the New World. But I think I mentioned this briefly last week. The Puritans came over and established their government, but then they did exactly the same thing that the church in England did. You had to, even if you weren't a Puritan, let's say you weren't someone who confessed to be a Christian, and you came to Massachusetts, you could live there, but you had to go to church. You had to pay not only your taxes, but you had to pay a tithe to support the minister. And so the Puritans really set up a state church. Like I said earlier, church and state were together. And in around 1635, a young man came over from England. He was a Puritan. He was a minister. His name was Roger Williams. Roger came over, but he had some ideas that were a little bit more radical than the Puritan leaders. Roger Williams, you need to know this name, so make sure you highlight it. Roger Williams believed strongly that the state should not have the power or the authority to tell individuals how to believe. He believed in what's called the liberty of conscience. This is very radical, but it's also very important for American government. Roger Williams's influence is right there in the First Amendment. So you need to know Roger Williams and his strong belief in separation of church and state. Your textbook has a great quote of his, and it says that Williams said, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. No authority, no state has the right to force anyone to worship or believe against their conscience." So that's radical, right? The Puritans have set up their government, their colony, and you have to be a part of their church. And if you're not a Puritan, if you haven't gone through conversion, hopefully by being in the church, you'll hear the gospel and you'll be converted. You have to pay a tithe to the ministers. This was horrifying to Roger Williams, and he talked about he preached against it. Of course, the Puritan leaders did not like it. Here's another thing that Roger Williams was very radical about. He told the Puritan leaders, it's wrong for you to take the land of the Native Americans. You see, the Puritans, they considered themselves to be like a new Israel. And if you're familiar with the Old Testament, God had led Israel into the promised land, and they pushed out the people of the promised land, right? They were told to push them out or to exterminate them or to subdue them. And so the Puritans felt like we're a new Israel. God has led us across the ocean, just like Moses led them out of Egypt. We are being led out of England on this great exodus into a new world, a new promised land. And we're going to set up our kingdom here. And there's these native peoples already living here. How did they do it in the Old Testament? They conquered them. They exterminated them. They pushed them out. And so that was kind of the mindset of Puritans in Massachusetts. Roger Williams said, that is wrong. You need to pay these people. If you want land, you need to pay them. Well, that did not sit well with the Puritan leaders. Roger Williams would not renounce his beliefs, and so in 1636 he was banished from Massachusetts. However, before they could imprison him, he escaped and he went south. I'll show you this here. So he escaped and went south during a very, very bad blizzard of 1636. And he went south and he came down to the Bay Area here. And he lived that winter with the Narragansett Indians. And then after that bad winter, he bought land from them. Right? He practiced what he preached. He bought land from them, and he founded what was at that time called Providence Plantation. Today, the capital of Rhode Island is where that was founded, Providence, Rhode Island. So this first settlement of the Rhode Island colony, which would be up here, was 1636. And when Roger Williams set up Providence, what do you think his philosophy of government was concerning other religions? Yes. Or are you just stretching?
So, he probably practiced that you can believe what you want.
Right.
Like, not to force religion on people.
Right. It was set up as a haven for anybody to come, no matter what your religion was. Even if you didn't have religion, you were welcome in Rhode Island because the state has no right to coerce belief. Within a few years, the leaders in Massachusetts were calling Rhode Island the sewer of New England. All kinds of riffraff had settled there in their thinking. So, any questions on the founding of Rhode Island? All right, before we take a break, we're going to just share with you that a couple of more settlements were founded within this Bay area. You had Providence Plantation, then you had Newport Plantation, and then there was one more. And eventually, all of these plantations in the Bay Area, they get this land also, and that is modern day Rhode Island. And in 1691, Massachusetts and Plymouth, are all one. So here would be Massachusetts. All right, let's take a 7-minute break, which on my clock is 10:16. So we'll be back at 10:23. All right, everybody back? We're ready to go?
Yes, sir.
Okay, for you to be able to look at with me, we are going to now kind of do a speed run through of the remaining colonies, and going to use this. Yeah, I think I like this one better. We're going to use this division. You have the New England colonies, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. The middle colonies, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New York, and then the 5 southern colonies. So kind of a rapid fire looking at these things. There won't be a lot on the test. I will mention and highlight the few things that you need to know. So we're going to go ahead and finish in New England. We've talked about Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Also, shortly after Rhode Island was founded, another reverend came down the Connecticut River from Massachusetts and founded the settlement of New Haven. Find that different map for you. So here is the Connecticut River, and the reverend's name was Reverend Thomas Hooker. Came down the Connecticut River into the Connecticut Valley and founded the Saybrook colony. Later, the New Haven colony was founded. And then there was a third settlement, I should say settlement, not colony, called the Connecticut settlement. And then those 3 eventually merged into modern day Connecticut. This was also a colony that was started for freedom of religion. And we want to be familiar with their government compact, which was called the Fundamental Orders. You'll want to know the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which were written in 1639. This was similar to the Mayflower Compact. It was another, basically a contract where the settlers would govern themselves. They would willingly submit to the leaders. They would obey the laws so that it would result in a peaceful society. That's all laid out in the Fundamental Orders, written in 1639. And so this map here just kind of shows you Connecticut in conjunction to Massachusetts, the Puritans. And Connecticut was also the Puritans were Congregationalists. That was their type of Christianity. They kicked out the Baptists and the Quakers and all the other kinds. Connecticut also was founded by Congregationalists. It was an official state religion, but they were not as strict as Massachusetts. So Rhode Island to the east, right, the sewer of New England, Massachusetts to the north, And we'll get into the middle colonies here in a little bit, where you see New York, and then New Jersey. And then, of course, Long Island is a part of New York. It runs almost the full length of Connecticut. Well, it does, south of Connecticut. Let me go back very quickly. I forgot an important person that I want you to be aware of. Roger Williams was kicked out, and he came down here, bought the land, started Plymouth or Providence Plantation. In 1638, another Puritan was banished from Boston, but this time it was a woman named Anne Hutchinson, and Anne Hutchinson, sorry. And Mrs. Hutchinson was married to a leader, and she basically, what she did was she started a home Bible study, really, where on Sundays after the sermon, she had invited many men and women to her home, and they would discuss the sermon, and then she would teach. How do you think that struck the leaders of Massachusetts? They didn't like it. And so, first of all, they didn't believe a woman should be teaching men in matters of religion. And then her Bible study was drawing bigger crowds than those going to the Sunday sermon. So kind of a double whammy for her and her husband, and her 13 children were banished. They went south also to Rhode Island. So Anne Hutchinson, one of her big religious beliefs that the leaders did not like was she believed that any Christian could hear from the Lord, could receive revelation from him. The Puritan leaders felt like the only way you can hear God is through the Bible. So that was very, very radical to them. So, all right, Connecticut is founded also as a congregational colony. Next, we want to go to New Hampshire. New Hampshire was founded, first of all, in 1629, and really it wasn't founded as a colony, but you had some settlers there. You had two men that were granted the land, and in the 1640s, they split it up into East and West New Hampshire, and then by 1679, it was one state, and it became a royal colony. It was similar to Connecticut. It was, kind of had a somewhat of a religious beginning, but not just primarily religion like Massachusetts. And there was also some economic motivation there. And so they were not as strict as Massachusetts. So those are our 4 New England colonies of the original 13. You can see on this map Maine, but Maine is not one of the original 13 colonies. And at that time, Maine was owned by Massachusetts. So you had New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, the 4 New England states. And here are some notes on the characteristics of the New England part of the New World. Of course, the Atlantic Ocean was very important. I'm sorry, I think I had I thought I had this up. But the Atlantic Ocean is very important for the economy there. Fishing and whaling. All right, sorry about that. Not the best of soil. A colder climate, as you can see. And the political climate of this area, or the political makeup, is they had town meetings. They did have different forms, but they did have representative government. Town hall meetings. People in the towns paying common taxes for upkeep of the roads. Things like that. They were primarily described or primarily associated with small coastal towns, although you did have settlers eventually moving to the frontier. And then, of course, the Puritans dominated the religious landscape. A part of their town hall philosophy was it was based on a covenant that the community shared. The government would make sure that laws were equal. Any inequality, any injustice would be adjusted. And so democracy was probably more prevalent in the New England colonies. One thing you have to remember is that for many of the English people, democracy was a bad word. They associated it with mobocracy. It was the ruling by the mob. So they didn't really like it. That's why they came up with representative government, where the people would pick their leaders who would then represent them. So the remaining, let's talk about the remaining middle colonies very quickly because we're almost out of time. Actually, let's go to the south first, because Virginia has already been, Jamestown, 1607, became a royal colony in 1624. The next state that was formed was Maryland to the north. It was 10 years later in 1634. It was founded by Sir George Calvert, Lord Baltimore. But Lord Baltimore soon died, and his son took over, and he wanted Maryland to primarily be a refuge for English Catholics. So Maryland was one of the priorities in its founding was to be a refuge for English Catholics who were experiencing persecution in England, which was an Anglican country. But Mr. Calvert also welcomed other religions. And he made he passed a decree or a statute that the Catholics of Maryland were to basically keep that religion a private matter, so that they would not, unfairly or unintentionally intimidate other religions. So it was a refuge primarily for Catholics, but it also had a good measure of religious toleration. But more Puritans were coming in, and they were starting to influence more, or they're starting to exercise more influence. So Calvert, the son, he passed in 1649 the Toleration Act, which was to protect the Catholic minority. But 5 years later, in 1654, the Puritans had gained the majority in Maryland, and they overturned it. And what was ironic was Calvert was driven out of his own colony. We want to talk about the North and South Carolina. These were one colony at first, simply called Carolina, in 1653. This big colony was originally started by Virginians who moved south. And 10 years later, 8 nobles wanted to go farther south, because the land in South Carolina, present-day South Carolina, the land was much more conducive for crops, plantations, things like that, much more fertile. So 8 nobles came in 1663, 10 years later. They received a royal charter. And so these Carolina was basically broken up into North and South Carolina. South Carolina became a royal colony in 1719, and North Carolina in 1729. They both exercised religious toleration, and primarily they were founded for economic reasons. And then the final southern colony of the original 13, so there's 5 southern colonies, was Georgia. Georgia was founded in 1732. It was the last of the 13 colonies. 21 trustees were appointed by King George II of England to settle this. So Georgia was named after King George. And there was 2 primary reasons for the founding of Georgia. Number one, King George wanted a buffer between the British colonies, and down here is Spanish Florida. Remember that? Spain owned Florida, and then much of the land along the southeast. So Georgia would be a buffer between Spain's territory and England. Don't want the Spanish to keep coming north, right? And then the second main reason why Georgia was founded was it was going to be a social experiment in which a utopia was created. But unlike the Puritans, who wanted a religious utopia, Georgia was going to be a utopia for the common man. All kinds of people could come, not just, the noblemen and aristocrats, not just religious Puritans or religious Catholics, but all kinds of people could come, families, single men, servants, and it didn't matter what religion you were. So Georgia was originally set up, and they set up in Savannah. There's an interesting picture in your textbook about how Savannah was set up, and everything was so orderly, the streets and the parks and the homes. They wanted to set up a little utopia. It did not work exactly how they had hoped it would. In 1754, Georgia becomes a royal colony as well. So the 5 southern colonies, they're characterized by large plantations with some main cash crops of tobacco and rice, indigo, and beginning in Virginia, they began with indentured servants, but they moved to slave labor. And I believe you can see the foundation being laid for this division of the country, which will be so easy to recognize in 1860. Even before then, the country is dividing between the North and the South. And you can see these characteristics that will continue to stay that way. All right, very quickly, the last of the middle colonies: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware. Now, New York, interestingly, was first settled in 1626 by the Dutch. So around the time that the English are founding Jamestown and Plymouth, the Dutch make a settlement, and they call it New Amsterdam, or New Dutch. They build a fort on this island called Fort Amsterdam, which eventually becomes New York City. And it was founded for economic purposes, not religion, but they did offer diversity for religion and other ethnicities. But by 1664, the English had taken it over. So we use 1664 as the date of New York becoming an English colony. Out of this area, and really it went all the way down to here, but out of this area came Delaware, established in 1638 as a trading post for furs. In 1655, it was called New Sweden. In 1682, it came under the stewardship of William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania in 1682. Pennsylvania was founded as a refuge for religious people, also similar to Rhode Island over here, but it was founded as a Quaker refuge. The Quakers were highly persecuted, and they welcomed other religions. William Penn had then gained stewardship over Delaware, and Delaware eventually became its own state in 1702. And then New Jersey was named after the island of Jersey in the English Channel. It was split up into East and West Jersey, eventually became New Jersey in 1702. But it was first founded in 1664 by some Englishmen. So that was kind of a quick, a quick brush through on that. We'll go over that again very briefly next on Thursday. But the middle colonies characterized as breadbasket colonies because they produced a lot of grain, diverse ethnically, and they had a lot of shipping and trade. Any questions on that? I will put that back up Thursday morning. Okay, have a great day, and we'll see you Thursday morning.